Hey, what's up, Scott Balcom here with Imagination Creation Films, and today, well, we're going back to basics. We're going to talk about shutter speed. So we all seem to have a little bit of free time lately, and we won't go into why, but I wanted to take the opportunity to do a little 101 on cameras and how to use cameras properly in motion or video. And I wanted to do it just a little bit different than pretty much everybody else on there on the internet. Well, because I tend to do things my own way anyway. But I wanted to explain what shutter speed is, or shutter angle, and we'll talk about that, and what it does and how it affects your motion or your story. And we're going to do that here on the drawing tablet. Why? Well, because it seemed like a perfect use for this, because honestly, I was going to do it on paper, but this seems just to be a little bit better. So when we talk about shutter speed, we're crossing really motion video, film cameras, and actual stills cameras. Stills cameras used shutter speed, and motion cameras, film, that actually used film, like this 8mm classic here, they used angle. Now, what is the difference between shutter speed and angle? Well, nothing. They do the exact same thing, but they're based upon two different purposes. So in film cameras, what you had was a mechanical shutter. And this shutter in here would open and close just like a photography one would, but it's based on a circle. It's based on a sphere. Now, let's go to the drawing tablet here and talk about it. So what we have is a perfect circle, which I can draw because I'm awesome. Not really. So we had a sphere, and this is the shutter. So the shutter would stay open for a period of time. So we had up here, we had 0, we had 180 degrees, right here was 90, right here was 270, and technically this is 360 degrees. So what would happen is the mechanical nature of these cameras, these are not electronic, they were mechanical. So a motor would spin, and it would spin at a specific speed to transfer the film through. Now, in this case, some of these cameras would be 18 frames a second or 24 frames a second. Standard film motion pictures was 24 frames a second. And so that speed of that motor would be driven based upon the putting 24 of those frames through the lens at 1 second interval. Now, because it was mechanical, they would use gears to drive the shutter. Now, the shutter would then stay open for as long as you had it set. So when they talk about a 180 degree shutter, we're gonna explain it here. So to fully go into this, so we're talking about 24 frames per second. That means that it's taking 24 images every second. Now we're going to break that apart, and we're only going to talk about one frame. So the frame takes 1/24th of a second for each frame. So you do 1/24th times 24, you get 1 full second of footage, which has 24 pictures. So 1/24th of a second is the timeline that we will be talking about here. And this is 1/24th. Now, the mechanical shutter inside, if you set it to a 180 degree shutter, that would mean that it's not open, it's closed until it gets to here. And we're just going to say closed. And then right here, it opens and it goes around to there. And it's open here. Now what you notice is this is a 360 degree circle. So that means that half of it was not exposed, which means it was blocked, so light couldn't get to the film. The other half was exposed. So now we've exposed it at 180 degrees. Now that seems a little weird for today, but it goes to the same math. So 180 degrees is right in the middle of 360. So this point to this point, this is 0, this is 360. 180 degrees would be exactly half of the 360, which is, if you do math, half of 360 is 180. But on top of that, if it's only open for half of the duration of the frame, and the frame we've already defined as 1/24th, then that means half of that means 1/48th. Now we're starting to bring in stills photography and digital, because 1/48th of a second is something you might find on a camera. On a stills camera, you would find 1/50th because it made more sense for them to do the math that way. We worked in 24 frames a second on film, and we tend to replicate that in digital. So what does it then mean for a 90 degree? Well, let's just do this, erase it right here. And now 90 degrees, which means we're only going to be open from this point to this point. So we follow it around, and the rest of it, we're closed. So it starts, it's closed, it's closed, it's closed, it's closed, it's closed. It gets 3/4 of the way through, and then it opens. And it opens for exactly 90 degrees of this circle, which, if we follow down here, is 90 degrees, or 1/4 of 1/24th. Now, what's 1/4 of 1/24th? Well, just scratch that out, multiply that times that, and you get 1/96th of a second. Hopefully this starts to make a little more sense. Now we can look at it this way. We can look at it could be open here and here. It doesn't really matter as long as it's consistent. 1/45th of a second would be here, or not, I'm sorry, 45 degrees would be here. 22.5 would be here. 11.25 would be here, and so on and so forth. Basically just halving this. That gives you a really good idea of where degrees comes from in the world of today, because it came from the past. So how does this all apply, and how does it make your footage look? Let's demonstrate that. So when we're talking about shutter angle and frame rate and shutter speed in all relative to each other, we're talking about motion blur. Now, motion blur is when you wiggle your hand real fast. Right now, I'm at 180 degree shutter on this camera. And if you do this, you can see that you don't really get a pure perfect hand here and a pure perfect hand here. You get this kind of in between. Now, the reason is the exact same as the clock. So, well, the circle, the degrees, the sphere, all of those good things, you get what I'm saying. So let's draw what motion blur is. So let's take this exact frame here. We've got this timeline. This timeline is 1/24th of a second. We don't really need that, do we? 1/24th of a second is the entire frame. Now, we have a hand that is right here. We are going to draw, look at that beautiful hand. It's right here. And it moves from this point right here all the way to this point right here in 1/24 of a second. Now, you're thinking, well, what does that mean? Well, it just means that my hand, if I'm moving like this, and it takes me 1 second to do this, then my hand moved from here to here in 1 second. That means in 1/24 of a second, it moved to here. And then the next 24, the next 24, but it's doing it in a fluid motion. We're only looking at this movement right here, just the 1/24th, the actual frame that's captured. So that is represented here, 1/24. Now, when we open this at 180 degrees, that means that we're only going to hold the shutter open until this point right here. That would be a 180 or a 1/48th of a second shutter. Now, what does that look like? If we're moving our hand from this point to this point over 1/24 of a second, again, this to this, if we're moving it fast, then we should get motion blur. But our motion blur will only be captured when the shutter is open. So we kind of get this kind of motion blur, which is a very natural motion blur. This is very natural to our eyes. Our eyes are not exactly 180 degree or 1/2 of a shutter speed or 1/2 of our frame rate, but it's pretty close. And it's what we consider acceptable. When we look, we kind of get that. So that's what it looks like right there with a 90 degree. Now let's go and take it a step further. Let's go to a 90. So this is 180, this is 90. That means that that the hand is actually moving all the way from this point to this point. But we're only going to capture in the frame, in the film, or in the sensor, we're only going to capture from this point to this point. That's 90 degrees, or 1/96th. What does that look like? Well, it looks less. We have a little less motion blur. Don't like that last one. We can go a step further and take it to 45-degree shutter angle, which would be right here. Now, 45 degrees, and my handwriting sucks, you're right, would not be 1/96th. It would be 1/192. So 1/192, it would be your shutter speed. Or on stills cameras, it's usually 1/200. And it's pretty close. It's close enough for government work. So now we've moved our hand from here to here in 1 second, but we've only captured it on the sensor or the film in this short period of time. So what does that look like? Well, you get just a little less motion blur. Now hopefully this is starting to make a little more sense. So when we're dealing with motion blur, we want to, or shutter speed or shutter angle, we want to consider what do we want the motion to look like. So a prime example is if you're having a fight scene and you see arms flying around like this, you don't really get to see the arm go by. You see a big motion blur. That is, it's not that attractive. And we want it to be more of a visual. We want to see those arms. We want to see the punch actually happen. So that's why they might shoot a fight scene at 90-degree shutter or 1/96th of a shutter. They might even shoot it at 45 degrees or 22.5. They do that because they want that staccato kind of look. So you'll get frames like this because in that 1/92nd of a shutter, my hand only moved this far, which means there's very little motion blur that will actually occur. Now, we can take this the opposite way. And we've established that normal and what we see that we like to our eyes is a 180 degree. It's very kind of standard. I just got jazz hands going on. It's a kind of a standard motion blur for our eyes. But what if we want to augment that and make it feel like we're out of our normal presence? Well, we might go to a 360 degree shutter. Now, what does that really mean? Well, if we do our circle and we have our standard, that means that the entire time it's open, it is exposed, which means that when our hand moves from here to here, that entire motion blur will be captured. Now, what that means is if we have a hand, God, that hand is horrible, and we're moving it here over 1/24 of a second, then we're going to have this motion blur like this. 360 degrees creates one hell of a long motion blur. You can even go further. You can go into a 720 degrees, which means that it exposes 2 frames in the span of 2 frames, but it's capturing basically 1/12 of a second. So now it's twice as long. So instead of this period being right here, 1/24, it's now 1/12, which means that hand, which would normally motion blur to here, is now motion blurring all the way across, and you get kind of a dreamlike state. Now, I know this is a bit long-winded and this is a little odd, but I really wanted to break this down so that you understood what was actually happening in your camera, or even your film camera or your photo camera, because it really helps you capture the intention that you're trying to capture. For instance, if you're wanting to capture a bee when you're doing photography, you would not choose a 180 degree shutter because that bee's wings is going to be flapping hundreds of times a second, which means you're just going to get this blur. So you'll see a blob and a blur. You don't want to see that. You want to see the wings. So you're going to get that shutter speed as high as possible so that the wings move as little as possible in the time that the sensor or the film was exposed. So 1,000th, 1/2,000th, 1/8,000th of a second, which means that, the hand moves just that much, which to you, when you capture it, is a beautiful, almost still image, even in film. So it allows you to serve your story just a little bit better when you can control your shutter speed, your shutter degrees, and the way you control motion blur. Now, let's throw in a couple of little curveballs. As you increase your frame rate, so we've talked about 24 frames a second, but let's say we're talking about 240 frames a second. Well, that changes things drastically because now my hand is moving from here to here. But instead of 1/24 of a second, so it's divided by 24, we're talking 240 frames a second. So that is now 1/240 of a second for the motion. So that means that from here to here is 1 second. We're not capturing at here. We're not capturing here or here or here or here or here or here or even in here. We're talking about one little tiny portion. Now, when my hand moves from here to here over 1 second, it's not going to capture very much. So even a 180 degree shutter on a 240 frames a second, it would only be moving the same amount as, in relative terms, as, let's see, 10 times the 180 degree. So that's 10 down. It's like 2 degrees, I think. I think that's about right. I don't know. You have to check my math on that. I'm just kind of doing it off the cuff. So to draw that out, what that means is we have 24 frames a second. We might shoot at 48. We might shoot at 60. We might shoot at 120, 240. So this would be 1/48th to be at a 180 degree. This would be 196. This would be 1/120th. This would be 1/240th. This would be 1/250th. No. This would be 1/480. All of these are 180 degrees because they're based upon this frame rate. But relative to each other, this one is twice this one, and then twice that one, et cetera, et cetera. So this would be 1/480th of a second, would roughly be, I don't know. Homework for you, do the math down below and put your comment down below because, hell, it'll be fun because math is hard and I mean, I can do it. I just don't think you want to sit around while I sit here and play math. So I hope that answers what shutter speed does mathematically and why physically it does what it does. And what do you think about that explanation? Was that difficult or hard, or did that open some eyes for you and help you understand what shutter speed is? Put those down below. Also, tell me what your favorite shutter speeds are or your shutter degrees to shoot and why. Do you like to shoot really open shutter so that you have dragging shutter, you get that dreamy light? Do you like that? Do you like the staccato feel of a fight scene? What do you like to shoot? Put that down below. Let's have a discussion. Also, remember to subscribe to this channel. It's a great group of filmmakers such as yourself, and we think you'd be a great part of it. Remember to click, not subscribe, the alert bell. That way you'll know when I live stream because I do that periodically. And yeah, as always, as I like to leave it, don't let your passions center around your life. Let your life center around your passions.